How many sets should you do for each muscle? I'm talking about sets per week, or what's known as weekly volume. Now for this video, I'm just going to say sets per week, and in fact I'm going to try and avoid any remotely technical language for many reasons. So there are probably 5 main things affecting our answer that we need to understand. 1. You need to do more sets to gain muscle than you do to maintain muscle. It seems obvious, right? But the less obvious thing is just how few sets you might be able to get away with. One study cut people's weekly sets down from 27 to 9 and found they didn't lose any muscle. Now, it's just one study, and maybe the result is partially explained by the fact that these were untrained participants who started on a very high workload, maybe too high, and then reduced to what is still actually quite reasonable for somebody who's only been lifting for 4 months now. That's just a possibility, but regardless, it's still a good indication that we can get away with reducing our number of sets, maybe significantly, without losing gains. Now, why am I talking about maintaining muscle? Don't you always want to be doing enough to gain muscle? Well, of course, but one day you'll be doing as many sets as you can fit into your finite schedule, maybe training 5 times a week for an hour and a half each session, and you can't just keep adding more sets forever. So at that point, one thing you could do is focus phases where you do fewer sets per week on some muscles with the aim of just maintaining those, and more sets per week on other muscles with the aim of improving those. Now, this only really applies to people who've been training for longer and are closer to their genetic limit. Everyone else can probably aim to make gains everywhere simultaneously, but it's something to keep in mind for later anyway. Number 2, people who've been lifting for a long time probably need to do more sets than people who haven't. When I say lifting for a long time, I'm using that as a proxy for how much progress you've made and the kind of workloads you're accustomed to. Obviously, if you've been doing like Mr. Motivator workout DVDs for 10 years, bicep curling, Heinz, spaghetti hoops, then you're not classed as an experienced lifter. So if you take studies looking at the effects of different set numbers per week and try and separate those into ones looking at trained participants and ones looking at untrained participants, it looks like the point at which gains start to decrease is lower for untrained people, around 20 sets a week. Even for untrained lifters though, although you can make some progress on just a few sets a week, 10 plus is still shown to be significantly better than doing less. So that's a good starting point for everyone. Number 3, you probably need to do more sets for some muscles than for others. There is some theory about how different muscles might need more or less work based on how they sustain muscle damage and how they contribute to something called systemic fatigue, but it is pretty loose, and based on what I could find, even if there is a general difference, I don't think it's a particularly large one. It's more useful to focus on our individual weak points. They might be weak points because of your bone structure and muscle insertions, making them appear less pronounced, or because they are genuinely less responsive to training than other muscles. It's pretty common for people to experience that. When you look at volume studies, you see that there are fewer of what they call low responders when people are doing high numbers of sets per week than when they're doing low numbers of sets per week. Now, that means that although there is a huge variance in how much muscle people gain in response to weight training, even those who respond less favorably can still improve their results by doing more sets. Now, as I said earlier, doing more sets per week for every muscle might not be feasible for everyone in terms of the time commitment, but it is much more realistic to apply this to individual lagging muscles and put more emphasis onto those by doing more sets than you do for others. Number 4, shorter rest periods mean more sets are needed. If you're taking longer rest periods like 2 to 3 minutes, you need about half the number of sets than you do if you're taking shorter rest periods of around a minute. And that's to get the same gains. Or put the other way, if you rest less, you need more sets. Now, I assume this is because if you're resting longer, you'll maintain your strength better between sets and probably get more out of each one. I'd probably still recommend avoiding very short rest periods on things like your leg presses or your bench press, but it is your call. Number 5, if you train more often, you can do more sets per week. Again, obvious, but I am going somewhere. There's an upper limit on how many sets per workout you can do for a single muscle group before your gains actually get worse. That seems to be somewhere around 8 sets, plus or minus a couple. Now beyond that, gains start to suffer, not just diminishing, but actually decreased returns. So for example, you might get better gains from doing 10 sets of chest on a Monday than from doing 20, all else being equal. So really your maximum sets per week for any given muscle should probably be 8 multiplied by however many times you can hit that muscle. Now you don't have to hit that set limit each workout because you do need room to train other muscles, but I'd just say every time you want to increase your number of sets above something divisible by 8, put the remainder in a different session. So you might do 8 sets of chest on a Monday, 8 on a Wednesday, and 4 on a Friday, giving 20 sets over the course of the week. Now, would it be more beneficial to do 7, 7, and 6, or 5 sets 4 times? Honestly, we are splitting hairs there. It probably doesn't matter. I think based on the evidence, a good starting point would be a baseline of 10 sets per muscle group per week for beginner lifters. That's probably not new to you. You can Google that and it'll tell you without having to sit through an 11-minute video. Now, added up for each muscle, this seems like a lot, but remember, some exercises do count as a set for more than one muscle. A squat or lunge would certainly cover both glutes and quads. So 5 sets of squats, 5 sets of hip thrusts, and 5 sets of leg extension gives 15 sets total, but you've still done 10 for glutes and 10 for leg extension. I think a good rule of thumb is to aim to make up at least half of your sets with isolation movements. This stops you from solely relying on things like your pressing exercises for your tricep development, where we know they do work your triceps, but a set of those is probably not worth the same as a set of overhead extensions, for example. For advanced lifters, studies show increases in gains right up to a very high set number per week, more than anyone could realistically fit in if they were training with anything remotely like a balanced program. So for advanced lifters, it's really as many as you can, for which I think 25 is probably a realistic upper limit, at least for everyone who isn't a pro bodybuilder and can't dedicate their whole lives to training and recovering. Now, most people still won't get close to that for multiple muscle groups, but for some muscle groups, for some people in extreme circumstances, it's doable. So 10 to 25 is a realistic range. That's still broad, but it's about as specific as current research can really get you. So from this point, I'm just going to tell you what I think based on my experience of myself and a few years of writing programs for or coaching other people. If you are a true beginner with 0 gym experience, set everything to 10 sets per week. If you go a bit over on biceps and triceps because of your compounds, then don't worry about it. Nobody ever complained about having arms that are too big. At this point, you don't know which muscles will be more or less responsive to training, so you have no reason to vary your sets for different muscle groups. Even if you do have your heart set on a huge chest, for example, I'd still wait to see how that muscle grows in response to training before altering your sets per week. Now, training 3 or 4 times a week is probably enough to get all of your weekly volume in, but if you do have a burning desire to train 5 times a week, you could push weekly sets for some muscles up to about 12. You might make gains a bit faster that way to begin with, but I imagine it would even out over time, so definitely don't feel like you need to train 5 times a week when you're an absolute beginner. By the time you've been lifting for 12 to 18 months consistently, you might notice some muscles being more responsive to training. You won't be to such high set numbers that you need to specifically focus on any individual muscles, but you might want to start deprioritizing some to bring your average sets up for the rest. I'd say 15 sets should be your benchmark for the muscles that you aren't deprioritizing. So for most people, that's probably going to be things like chest, shoulders, quads, and maybe lats. Some muscles might stay at 10, some might even be less. If you naturally have very developed calves, for example, not me, then you might only need to do 6 sets per week, or you might actually not need to do any, in which case, don't, spread the free time across other muscle groups. Now, in general, you don't need to be doing crazy high set numbers at this stage. So with most muscles at 15 sets and the rest somewhere between 10 and 15, you will be doing great. Once you've been lifting for a few years, again, probably more sets needed, but also more scope for prioritization. Those muscles that you can afford to deprioritize are more important than ever, because at this point, you're probably going to be spending as much or close to as much time in the gym as your lifestyle permits, which means any space that you can free up is valuable. So don't be scared to keep some muscles at their bare minimum if that's truly all you need. I still think for most of your major muscle groups, 15 to 18 sets is plenty. To put that in context, it's like doing 4 sets of 2 chest exercises on a Monday and then the same on a Thursday, or at the upper limit, 6 sets 3 times a week, which is quite a lot. So for muscles that you really want to prioritize, you might manage around 20 to 24 sets per week. If you're getting close to maxing out your number of sets for a single muscle in a single workout, and you do that like 3 times across the week. Now that's a big ask and not something you could do for more than 1 or maybe 2 muscle groups at a time. And even then, it might not be sustainable long term. So this might be something you look to apply using those focus phases that we mentioned at the start of the video. The last thing to mention is that there's some evidence to suggest gradually ramping up your weekly sets is better than just sticking to your highest possible sets consistently. So as an oversimplified example, let's say you have time to do roughly 25 set workouts 5 times a week. Now you could start by doing 18 to 20 set workouts 5 times a week, still proportioned between muscles based on priorities, and then you could gradually ramp that up until you're maxed out on 25 sets per workout. Do a couple of weeks there and then drop back down and repeat. Alright, that's it. I hope it helps. Don't want to waste your time any more with an outro than I do with an intro, so see you later, I guess.
Jordy Lenny is my hero.